If we are going to take OPEC and just talk about OPEC for a second, maybe also just give them a quick introduction. How are they viewing these times ahead? Because I don't know the cultural how they're thinking, sort of like in this narratives we see in Europe, because in Europe we are very focused on renewables and a green future. But how is this the same narrative in sort of the OPEC countries, or is that a totally different,
We have, of course, we have OPEC, and that's 13 countries. They are all developing countries. And then we have another 10 countries. That's so the total is 23. Those 23 make up the OPEC plus. And OPEC plus, Russia is part of OPEC plus. So 2 points here, that for OPEC and OPEC plus members, they did not want to bother Putin because they are part of the same organization, and they don't want to break up that organization where they invested massive amount of money and time in creating it and achieving great results, because they were able to move prices from, as you know, from like an average about $18 to $85. So that was a great success for this cooperation, and losing it quickly does not make any sense, especially if we end up with a recession very soon. Because if you end up with a recession, you need to cooperate again to cut. And if you break it, then forget about it. But from OPEC point of view, what we've seen from the recent meetings, the G20 meeting in Rome, and then we have the COP26 in Glasgow, the oil producers played a significant role in both meetings. First of all, in both meetings, we've seen a division between West and East, especially when it comes to coal. So you have India, China, and Australia on one side, and the Western countries on the other. And there was big division. That's why in both cases, the final communique basically was delayed. They couldn't agree on the format and what's written in it, and that they couldn't get it out on time to the press. It was the oil producers who found themselves between the East and the West, and they moderated between the two. So all of a sudden they found a leadership role in both COP26 and the G20. At the same time, those countries, they realized that they have big opportunities when it comes to climate change policies and technologies. For example, if you look at a country like Saudi Arabia or the UAE, they are leaders in renewable energy. Especially if you look at the UAE, they have even nuclear right now, the first Arab country to have a nuclear plant. But they have renewables, they have solar, they have wind. Saudi Arabia right now is building solar and wind. Why? It makes perfect sense for them to do so, because they have remote areas, they need the power, otherwise they have to ship the oil to those areas. And shipping oil to those areas is extremely expensive. So it makes economic sense for them to use renewable energy. On the other hand, even if they use more renewable energy, they can save more oil for exports. They can save oil, natural gas for industry. So there are benefits for them from adopting renewable energy. At the same time, they know that hydrogen is really needed in Europe and other places because it's supposedly clean, and they can produce hydrogen, especially blue hydrogen, from their oil and gas. And therefore, they can do all those efforts toward, they call it carbon neutrality. I mean, toward it, yes, but no one is going to achieve the carbon neutrality for various reasons. But the idea is OPEC members are really active because there is too many low-hanging fruits they can harvest.
Great summary. Where do you feel like OPEC disagree, or what's the hardest conversations they have in between them in meetings?
Well, generally speaking, let's kind of look at it in a way that's kind of tell the story. OPEC members in particular are not, or OPEC is not a coherent group. Iraq is part of OPEC. Iran is part of OPEC. And there was a war between those two countries for 8 years, as you know. And yet they continue to come to OPEC and meet at OPEC, and they left their politics behind. Iraq invaded Kuwait, and yet Kuwait and Iraq are parts of OPEC. in this case. We had problems between Libya and Saudi Arabia, yet both of them showed up to the meeting. So it's an odd group in that sense, but they continued meeting and they continued talking about production, changing production, etc., etc. So by nature, oil is a political commodity, but by nature, OPEC basically was able to deal with that politics for a long period, since 1960 when it was established. Now we have OPEC Plus. So 10 countries, including Russia, are added to it. The main difference right now between what happened now and in the past is that in the past, when we end up with a tight market, most of the countries couldn't increase production. So Saudi Arabia and the UAE would increase production to compensate. And then countries will get angry because they said, look, you walked with me halfway and then you took my market share and now you are increasing production, lowering prices. That's not fair. And all those agreements failed historically. The new thing that we've seen with OPEC Plus is something new. And that's when you are asking about what was the hardest. That was the hardest, is to convince countries to cut production and convince them that those big countries with spare capacity are not going to compensate. And that's really what happened. For the first time in history, they did not compensate for those who did not increase production. So they did not infringe on their market share. And that worked. But to build that until they reached that level, that was very hard.
You read an article about the optimal price on oil, or the sweet spot. And you said if it goes higher, it's bad. And if it goes lower, that's also bad. Can you just talk us through that article and why you came to that exact sort of sweet spot?
Yes. So the idea here is, what is the optimal price for consumers and producers at the same time? And there are conditions for that. So there are many conditions, but I will mention a few. You need a price where investment in the oil business will continue, so investors will get return on investment, where renewables and other substitutes, whatever those substitutes are, basically will not be killed. Because we do need all sources of energy, we need all sources of technology, we need all sources of transportation technology. So while we want the industry to grow and we want investors in the industry to make money, we don't want other energy sources to suffer at the same time. At the same time, we need a case where economies will continue to grow. We don't want oil prices to rise to the level where it kills economic growth. So we want a price basically where it's good for everyone, where producers are happy, investors are happy, consumers are happy, other energy sources are happy, economies are growing, and therefore politicians are happy in this case. So it's that's what the sweet spot is. It makes everyone happy. If prices go higher, then consumers are not happy. If consumers are not happy, then their politicians are angry. Then they are going to meet and devise policies that are harmful to everyone. And therefore, everyone is not going to be happy at the end. And if prices are low, then investors are not happy and they are not going to invest enough. And then we are going to head for energy crisis, and oil prices will go high in the next cycle because investors are not making money and therefore they are not investing. So briefly, these are some of the ideas.
But how did you land on the exact interval, and can you also share the exact price that you?
Well, I have a model. Basically, I used over 90 variables to reach that, and this keeps changing all the time as government expenditures, as inflation, as interest rate, the value of the dollar, other things change all the time. So that interval basically keeps changing. But there is a misunderstanding for those who read my tweets, and there were several comments on them. There is misunderstanding here because they thought with inflation, the sweet spot increases. It's exactly the opposite. With inflation, the sweet spot decreases. So inflation is not good for producers because it kills demand.
Got you. If you look at oil reserves, there's also, I guess, a big distinction between having large amount of oil reserves versus, making economic sense of that. It all depends on technology, if it's offshore, on land, etc. Because one country that stands out in that sense, I guess, is Venezuela. in terms of the oil reserves, but also making sure that it's profitable and structured the right way. Can you talk a bit about sort of the oil reserves you are seeing in the global perspective and how you think that will play out going forward?
Generally speaking, we have to make the distinction here between two groups of oil producers. If you look at countries like Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Kuwait, for example, they are very successful. And one of the reasons why they are very successful because they kept the national oil companies separate from politics. And that was a great formula for them. In Venezuela, what we've seen is politics took over the company. And because they took over the company, several things happened. We know in April 2002, when PDVSA workers striked, what Chavez did, basically, he fired them and he brought in political appointees who know nothing about the oil industry. So they literally, because they are not experts, they killed the company. At the same time, the government has no other income, so they kept taking money from the company above the threshold needed to maintain the reserves, to maintain exploration, to maintain production, to maintain the integrity of the wells, of the equipment, of the refineries, etc., because of that politics. So the government literally sucked the air out of PDVSA, and PDVSA collapsed. While if you look at other countries like in Saudi Aramco or KPC in Kuwait or ADNOC in the UAE, they separated politics from the company, and the company has certain taxes it pays at the end of the year. The rest they can use it, invest, do whatever, expand, do what they do best, which is explore and produce. So the idea here is this separation is essential for the success of the oil industry in any country.
But do you also think then that history will repeat itself going forward? Do you think anything fundamental can change?
No, basically we've seen, when it comes to politics, history keep repeating itself. We've seen this so many times in the past and just keep coming back. What is sad about Venezuela is they went through the cycle so many times since oil was discovered in Venezuela, and they have military coups and they have changing governments, etc. And they have not learned from those cycles. But Venezuela basically was on the forefront at one point of time in establishing OPEC. They were instrumental in establishing OPEC. And the views of Alfonso Perez, who was the Minister of Development at that time, were amazing. I mean, this guy is truly a philosopher who should be ranked like with other well-known leaders in philosophy of the current age. And he came up with the idea of OPEC in the early 40s. But what people do not know is that the aim of OPEC when it was established is to get rid of dependence on oil. And that's what people do not understand. OPEC is not about maintaining oil demand and maintaining oil forever. OPEC was established to move those countries beyond oil before even Europeans and others think about it.